the term historian's eye is meant sincerely. I really am trying to kind of focus on the present, but think historically about it. And Nikhil Singh is one of the folks who I've interviewed. So today, I guess he's turning the tables a little bit.
I'm gonna try. Matt, if you go through the site, there are very extensive interviews done with all kinds of people, and the transcripts are available. And if you read any of those, one of the things you'll see is what a brilliant interviewer Matt is. And so I was trying to actually read through them and figure out what makes somebody a good interviewer. And that's going to be one of my questions to you. But I realized what makes a good interviewer is that the good interviewer does not speak very much, and that's like not something that I'm not good at. So, but what I wanted to start by asking you, and hopefully you can think of your questions too in the course of this conversation, is you've been doing this now for 4 years. Do you have some reflections to offer as a sort of starting point on what kind of a historical period you think this is?
Yeah, well, the thing that got me started and the thing that has prompted me to keep going, and this is open-ended. I mean, this is an experiment whose end I don't know how, this may just end up being about the Obama years, however many years that turns out to be. It may be ongoing, and I'm not sure. But the thing that I have been trying to document, the thing that struck me in 2008, and that I think still is a quality of American life, is that the choice between Obama and McCain, and especially McCain-Palin, was a fork in the road like nothing else in my experience in American life. And there was this sense that we were about to offer up our very best or our very worst, and it could go either way, and it was going to be close, and you just didn't know what was going to happen. And there's a sense in which I have continued to feel that throughout the Obama years. I feel it in the onset of the next election cycle. And the most striking thing, I think, in the archive, and you hear it again and again in different ways in the interviews, is that everybody is feeling a version of that people across the political spectrum, obviously one person's hope is another person's despair, right? So that's the one thing that Rick Santorum and I have in common, is that we both feel that 2012 could be a disaster, although we interpret we interpret it in opposite ways. But there is this sense, there's a great scene in a movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where they're trying to decide something really important, and there's a toss of the coin, and the coin comes down on its side, and it stays that way, standing up. And I feel like that's the best metaphor I know of for the historical moment that we're in right now, and it has kind of continued to feel that way to me throughout these 3 years, with the combination of the increasingly disappointing but still kind of amazing Obama presidency, the incredible backlash against him, what the Republican Party has become before our very eyes, and the economic collapse. All of these things are converging and continue to converge in ways that make this feel like a very particular moment of hope and danger.
So, I mean, one of the things that you point to, and it seems this project connects with, and the opening slide that you had before, you had that up there, the photograph which says better history. Maybe you could reflect for a few minutes on that phrase, better history, because it strikes me that it has many different valences for you. I know it's a term that comes out of one of Obama's addresses, so you might speak about that directly, but it also seems like you're trying to call for us to produce better history as a way of becoming better informed, more engaged, more connected to what's actually going on. In other words, that better history does something for us as individuals, as collective, and so forth. So maybe you could just talk about that phrase a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so the phrase comes out of the inaugural address when Obama says I'm paraphrasing, but something like, "It's time to recapture our better history, that noble idea that all are created equal, that all should have equal access," something like that. That slide that you were looking at that actually is no longer up there. That's a piece of graffiti on 10th Avenue. It doesn't exist anymore. Actually, the wall that it's on was torn down. But it was done with a stencil, so it looks official. It just says better history. If you hit the Yeah. There you go. If you hit where it says historian's eye up at the upper left.
Yeah, I think it's low.
I think the internet is really slow.
Oh, okay. So somebody inspired by Obama's words came along and painted this big sign that says "Better History." You can't really see it here because the second person to come along was using a much lighter marker, but a second person came along and altered it to say "Bitter Future." So actually, this piece of kind of layered graffiti spoke to exactly that quality I was just talking about, that kind of the hope and the fear, the hope and the danger, the kind of doubleness of the moment. But it does become more than just a logo for the project. It does become, in a sense, as you're saying, a kind of an aspiration of the project. And I suppose what I mean by better history as a set of scholarly practices is, first, well, there are a couple of things. One is to slow down. So I know that this site will never attract as many viewers, not even a tiny sliver, not a fraction, as major media outlets. But that doesn't mean that it can't talk back to those outlets in an important way. And one of the ways that it talks back is it displaces the 20-second soundbite with the 1-hour interview. And it just says, let's spend some time. Let's really hear the voice of the unemployed office worker for an hour, and let's hear her story, and let's hear the moments that she chokes up, let's hear her sighs, let's hear her humor. And so it kind of stretches out analysis in a way that really goes against the momentum of the culture in a certain way. And I think the photographs kind of do that in a similar way, in that the scale of the galleries invites you to kind of linger in a certain way, that so it's not just like an image a second like you get from the rest of the culture. It's really inviting a kind of reflection that I do think is productive in academic terms, but also productive in civic terms, if you will. So that's the provocation, I think, is to notice in a different way, to see in a different way. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people in a lot of places who never even actually noticed how many closed businesses they were surrounded by in their town, whether that's Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or Manhattan, until they saw this gallery and it kind of prodded them to notice and to think about it. So that's one dimension of it. Another, the photographs, I think, invite a kind of archaeological understanding of the passage of time and ways of reading the visual landscape in a way that allows you to kind of think historically. So you can see in most towns, like you can see the post-2008 layer of economic distress in the recently closed businesses. But in most towns, especially like towns in the Northeast, you can see the slightly longer or deeper kind of stratum of maybe 25 years of economic distress that's involved with kind of the post-industrial society, the plant closings, the kind of slow slide and collapse of the manufacturing sector, those kinds of things. You can see that in the old warehouses and the old factories, alongside this other layer of 2008. So I think that the gallery is kind of training you to look differently upon your surroundings and kind of reflect historically on them.
One of the things that I find always interesting, since we're, you are undergraduates, and so I'm really curious, and I think Matt will be curious as well, to hear your thoughts about how history matters, or if history really matters to you. One of the things that I always think about as a teacher is I come into a classroom, and I've been coming to the same classroom with different students now for over 20 years, and then it will sometimes occur to me that you are only really maybe socially and politically conscious since 9/11, maybe even since Katrina. In other words, one of the interesting questions I always put to my students is, what was the moment that you became aware that you were living in a social and political context? What was the event? What was the time that you had an awareness of something that puts you into a larger frame? And it strikes me that one of the imperatives of this project, and this is why I want to stick with this idea of better history, is that you're both talking about better history as a kind of moral imperative. Like, what are the best moments in our history? And I think that Obama's in an ideal sense is a reflection of that. You know, the idea that someone who is a descendant of or who is connected to a community that descends from slavery could become president of the United States is an example of progress, historical progress. And when Obama uses the term better history, he explicitly points to the struggles of women for equality, the struggles of workers for the rights to organize, the struggles of African Americans and other people of color against various kinds of discrimination. So those become examples of our better history. But at the same time, it seems like better history is an empirical question for you, which is to say, how do we produce a better account of the past? How do we produce an account of the past that is more faithful and more fully reflective of who we are, right? And that idea of producing a more faithful account, a fuller account, somehow for you connects up with producing a better account. So in other words, those two different kinds of imperatives come together in a certain kind of way. And so one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that that seems to be explicitly related to a sort of a democratic imperative, if you will. The idea that the better history is the history that is more democratic, in the sense that it's the history that's more inclusive, but it's also the history that is, in a sense, produced democratically. Right? And your own site, it seems to me, in the way you've produced it, points to that idea. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think the idea here, it seems to me, is that we are the producers of our history, all of us, and that if history is truly the site of a democratic practice, and a site that can reflect that democratic practice, what does it look like when we think of it that way? Yeah,
there are definitely, I mean, two different planes to that, I would say, or dimensions. One is that kind of democratic voice. That is, I mean, this project takes a lot of inspiration from people like Studs Terkel, who was passed away recently, but for 60 years and more was a very famous Chicago radio figure who really made his name just talking to ordinary people. Came from a working class family, talks about his own kind of political education as like hearing these arguments among like machinists and plumbers around his parents' kitchen table when they were doing like union strategizing. And it convinced him that there's a kind of brilliance, a kind of vernacular brilliance. There's like the brilliance of the ordinary people that just gets lost in the culture. And so part of what his interviews are about, or were about, was recapturing that. And certainly the inspiration for this project really tries to carry that forward. And I think that it proves his hunches to be true, that there are so many interviews in the archive where you just hear a kind of vernacular theorizing about the world that is nothing short of brilliant, but it's not anything you're going to hear when you click on the TV and listen to the people who are paid to make pronouncements, right? There's a kind of vernacular theorizing that is really rich and really important. And so one of the democratic impulses of the project is to capture it and make it available, to kind of make our collective wisdom available in a way that it's not. Another dimension, though, I think, of the democratic part of it, and this was something I started thinking about really right after the election, as Americans in general were reflecting on what a historic moment it was, I was reflecting as a historian on how do we explain this, because I don't know anybody, myself included, who really thought in 2007, say, that we were just on the verge of electing an African American president. In fact, I think most people at that time, and most people in retrospect who I've talked to, have said they thought it would never happen in their lifetimes, right? And so one of the things I started thinking about right after the election is, regardless of what happens next, regardless of what the history of this presidency turns out to be, we have a job to do now, knowing that as an electorate we just did this thing that nobody thought was possible. And it's a chance for us to kind of turn back around and look across the topography of the last couple of decades since the civil rights movement and rethink them. Because I think there are certain things about the nature of social change that we clearly don't understand, and that Obama is here to tell us. We know now, 3 years on, that there's certainly plenty of continuity. I mean, we are obviously not in a post-racial moment. There's nothing, there's so many of the problems, the stratifications, the violence, the prison industrial complex. I mean, there are a million things that you could point to, and not least the virulent treatment of Obama by his opponents. We know that racism is alive and well, and yet it's no small thing that millions of people imagined an African American president and pulled the lever in his favor. And I think that's something, it's a kind of undercurrent of our recent history that still requires some explanation. And so part of what, at least some of this archive is speaking to that, about, how do we understand how we got to this point that so few would have predicted a few years ago, and is there anything usable in that? What can we kind of reclaim from the subterranean movements of what seemed such bleak times, right? The 1980s, most of the 1990s, in civil rights terms, in terms of racial politics, these were not terribly hopeful moments, and yet somehow underneath the surface something really important was going on that requires some analysis and some thought.
It strikes me one of the really, I have so many different kinds of questions, but it strikes me that one of the really challenging things, though, about what you're proposing is in getting away from a soundbite orientation or starting to try to think historically about social change. But also thinking of the present as a historical period, is trying to linger for longer on what actually is going on, and to actually think in a deeper way about how long it might take to actually produce the kinds of changes that we are looking for. And it seems to me that is one of the hardest things of all. When you think of something like the civil rights movement and you study it historically, you realize that people struggled for 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years to gain things that we come to think of as very basic. And one of the things that's really striking in the accounts that I often hear from students, many of whom worked very hard on Obama's behalf and felt very excited by the election, as did many of us, is a very justifiable sense of disillusionment 3 years later, where there's almost the collapse of hope is also a collapse of the sense that our actions to sort of work in the public domain, to act civically, to organize, actually make a difference.
Right.
And I think part of that the collapse of that hope comes from a sense of not being able to think historically.
Right. Well, we need to be able to slow ourselves down. I mean, I heard this. There was, this past year was the 50th anniversary of a lot of the really significant milestones in the civil rights years, including the freedom rides. And so there were a lot of kind of retrospectives. And at one of these gatherings, a now maybe 70-something-year-old former SNCC worker, that is Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was talking about the revolutionary patience that was required of them. And I just thought that was such a brilliant formulation, because we associate revolution with impatience, right? And revolution, the idea of revolution often actually goads us towards impatience. But he was saying learning the revolutionary patience and understanding the kind of plodding nature of the kinds of civil rights work they were doing, how important it was to keep doing the work with no signs of progress, often for long stretches of time, but also to keep doing the work knowing that revolutions don't happen overnight. And that seems to be a lesson that we really lost. And so one of the things that you see in Obama disillusionment, and by the way, I mean, I think there are all kinds of reasons one might be disillusioned with Obama. I think that he's turned out to be maybe more centrist or more of a compromiser than a lot of us thought. I think that he's turned out to be just the sort of politician you don't want facing the buzzsaw that is the Republican Party that really just wants to destroy everything he wants to do. So there are all kinds of things we might say about the Obama presidency, but one of the really striking ones, and I think that it's really important, is that we were fooled, many of us were fooled for a moment in 2008 into thinking that we were participating in a social movement, and actually we were participating in an election, and that was a hard lesson. It's like, oh man, after all that, all we did, seemed so historic, and all we did really was elect a president, right, and a pretty centrist one at that. So I think that there was a kind of letdown in that. I've heard that versions of that. I mean, that shows up in the recordings all over the place. People saying some version of that or observing that in themselves, that they really thought it was more of a moment than they thought, or somebody saying, look, this is Ricardo Levins Morales. If you want to listen to the interview, but he's a brilliant political thinker, really, really brilliant. And one of the things he says is, look. It takes revolutionary visionaries to push a door open, but it's almost never revolutionary visionaries who walk through it, and that's one of the ways to kind of think about Obama in the long kind of post-civil rights history, and how to even think about the post-civil rights era. Or another, Fred Moten, who's beyond disillusioned. He's an African-American poet and professor in Durham, North Carolina. Who says he won't even vote for Obama. He said, that's a gesture I don't need to make. I make meaningful gestures that are about the black struggle. That's a gesture I don't need to make. Other people can make that. But again, kind of noting the limitations of the presidency itself, actually, and what can be done from that office, whether it's a white president or a black president.
Well, I think this raises maybe the last sort of set of questions. I'm not. When did you say we had until 3:50?
Yeah, maybe another 10 minutes. And
yes. Yeah, that would be great. One of the things about the historical is that it takes a narrative form, and so then one of the questions becomes, to which set of stories do we belong? And one of the things that's noticeable in the narration, even of this project, is how it moves from Obama to the recession to Occupy. Mm-hmm. So in a certain kind of sense, you seem to be moving away from a kind of state-centered, even electorally centered idea of kind of what defines the sort of historicity, if you will, mm-hmm. of a certain kind of moment, which in itself strikes me as a very democratic move. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there is a way in which this narrative, and this is certainly a big question for American studies, remains very focused on the United States and a certain sort of set of historical reference points that are related to the United States. And one might say, for example, that the most historical event of our moment are the revolutions in the Middle East, in the Arab mm-hmm. world, the so-called Arab Spring, or any number of other possible moments. In other words, again, that question of what makes something historical and what set of histories do we see ourselves as being most invested in. Partly that's also become a radically pluralized question for many people, particularly in this sort of digital moment mm-hmm. where it's very possible to move across time and space from a singular location with much greater ease, and to communicate across time and space from a singular location with much greater ease. I think that's both one of the signs of hopefulness in our moment, but it's also one of the signs or one of the symptoms of shall we say, vertigo that we sometimes mm-hmm. feel, which is to say, things are moving so fast, so many different things are happening. Where is the center? Do we need a center? Because certainly if there is a center, it's not holding. So I wonder if you might, that's not really a question, and maybe it's a little too open-ended,
Right.
but I wonder if you might reflect on that question. The
Yeah.
question, in some ways, it's a question about where we are in the United States in the world today.
Right.
Because that's also something that is changing quite dramatically, and that perhaps is the biggest disappointment that Obama represents in some ways, because I think one of the things many of us thought would be that he would be someone who would actually help to reorient the country away from an imperial foreign policy,
Right.
and actually bring the United States into the world in a different way. And that was part of the starkness of the contrast
Right.
with the Bush administration. And that really hasn't been borne out.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's interesting. I agree. I mean, certainly the full flower of that promise has not borne out. I mean, as we fight 2.5 wars. But on the other hand, there have been waves of revolution and reform across the Middle East with no American flags burning, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. And I do think that,
Not yet.
well, we'll see, right? We'll see. But I do think that in much of not all of the Middle East, but in much of the Middle East, actually people are receiving America differently than they were in any time prior. I mean, go back all the way to the Iranian Revolution, right? I mean, so that, I mean, I think that says something that's worth at least noting. On the social media question, I mean, one of the things, I mean, this project is both documenting it and participating in it. I mean, I am trying to get people to help build the archive, because it's an archive worth building, and it's also an archive that will be lost if we don't collect it. I mean, that was one of the really striking things to me. Was I was in Berkeley a couple years ago and was hearing about these really violent clashes between students and police. I mean, they were police riots, basically, in Berkeley and Oakland. I mean, it started with peaceful demonstrations over the budget cuts to the UC system, but ended in these just full-blown police riots that were incredibly violent. And everybody had pictures on their cell phones of what had happened, but nobody had ever thought of trying to collect them. And now they actually are being collected, and they're going to end up on the site. But I think that's a terrifically important archive, because, I mean, in a way, it's a way of contextualizing that iconic image of the pepper spraying at UC Davis. I mean, there's a whole backstory to that has never been archived or curated, or there's no possibility of reflection on it, because the materials haven't been put together in such a way. So on that level, I'm kind of participating in the new media, by reaching out to people and getting them to reach out to me in a way that I think is important. At the same time, one of the things I see everywhere I go is the world is already coming to people in a mediated way, because everyone is looking at the world through their cell phone camera, right? You go to an Occupy demonstration and the cell phones are out, and it's like people are participating, but they're also participating and documenting, which is a different kind of attention, So, I mean, I think that it's a very mixed picture in terms of what the social media are giving us, or what they're making possible, and what they're also taking away from our political moment at the same time. The bigger kind of American question that you're asking, one of the things that has been on my mind a lot, and really I would see the BP oil spill a couple summers ago as a real marker in the development of this. I mean, everyone was concerned with that as an environmental disaster, which clearly it was, and most of the talk was about oil, for obvious reasons. But under the surface of that discussion, there was also this discussion of who's going to turn out to be more powerful in this equation. Is it going to be the United States of America, or is it going to be British Petroleum? And I think that is, we are at, and it was kind of astonishing that Obama actually was able to extract $20 billion in reparations from BP. I think a lot of people didn't think he would be able to. But one of the things that's marking about our moment is the ways in which, and that this has been a long-term development since the mid-20th century, and it's already affected most parts of the world, but is just now beginning to affect us, and that is the ways in which the nation-state is taking a back seat to the corporation when it comes to the major kind of aggregations of power and wealth. And that our corporations are beginning to treat us the way that they've treated the third world for 2 generations, and Americans are just kind of waking up to that. So that seems like one of the really important kind of transnational stories that's being told in this moment.
Well, I think that's fantastic, and maybe it's a good place to open it up to questions for Matt, comments, things that struck you in the conversation that you'd like to follow up on.
Okay.
And maybe just say your name when you speak.
My name is Shirley. And when you said Obama McCain campaign, you quote unquote fork in the road. I'm thinking of what Mark Twain said about if you stand still, you get run over. Because you said Obama presidency has been destroyed, like his whole, being a president, and it can internally destroy the campaign of presidency. But when you look on the broader picture as a filmmaker, you think of the positive things that has come out of it. For example, this picture right here. Would you film this picture right here? Trayvon Martin. This is a positive image. When Obama went to Ghana, Accra, also a positive image. Have you ever thought of capturing those?
I think that, yes, and I have some. But I think that I'm not sure I'm totally comfortable with the framework of positive and negative, but it does refer to something real, so let's stay with that. The positive side of the archive, I think, is collected more in the audio, and the negative side of the archive is more in the visual. And I just think that that's a function of my eye. And part of the invitation, by the way, the invitation to collect and to contribute material is also to correct what I'm doing and to kind of talk back to what I'm doing and to redirect it or inform it in a different way. So that's a sincere invitation to provide materials that you think address some kind of deficiency in what already exists in the archive. So part of it is just my own sensibility, what captures my eye, what my camera seeks out. But what my camera is doing is always informed by what I'm hearing and getting from the interviews. There's a lot of back and forth between the two parts of the archive in ways that I think are much more visible or salient to me than they could possibly be to the viewer. But I mean, a lot of the things that I've photographed taking prompts from interviewees who have either alerted me to something, as this unemployed worker in Manhattan was the one who was saying, have you ever noticed all the space available signs? It's the only marker out there of our like kind of collapse of our city. And that's when I started taking those photographs. There are a lot of things like that in the archive. But because of the nature of people, I don't believe necessarily in human nature, but my experience in listening to people for hours and hours and hours is that there's a kind of resilience and strength and humor that can make even the darkest moments positive in a particular way. And they're very inspiring to me. And I think that the audio archive carries more of that kind of positive freight than the photographs do.
Okay. Last week, Annette Danto, are you familiar with her?
I'm sorry?
Annette Danto. Well, she's a filmmaker, and she had a seminar in regards to ethical and unethical media issues. And when you capture a picture, there was an audience member who said he captures every picture, but not here in America. He goes to certain remote location, and he captures pictures that anything that catches his eyes. And my question to him was like, you capture pictures of people who don't want to be filmed, things that can be issues of stereotype, discrimination, or even Section 60, which is privacy. These are things I want to know, like, when if you're very conscious and very selective.
Absolutely. I mean, there are things that I've consciously chosen not to photograph. Either because there was reason to believe that the photograph wasn't welcome, or that I judged that it might be dangerous. Like, if I thought that I was possibly photographing someone who was an undocumented immigrant, I would not snap the picture. in the way I work, like out in the world, and so much of what a lot of what I've photographed doesn't even involve people. It's like the built environment a lot. When I am photographing people, it's most often, in settings where they are kind of putting themselves out there to be photographed in a way, right? They're at a demonstration. The job of being at a demonstration is to make yourself photogenic and to be photographed, right? And to propel the message. So there's a kind of unwritten consent already there. But one of the techniques that I hit upon, and this was just kind of worked this way, and it clearly did work, was when I was at the mall for the inauguration, was kind of making my presence known and making contact with a lot of people with the camera so that they knew that they were being photographed and had plenty of chance to let me know that they didn't want to be. And kind of building a kind of consent that way, because I mean I have consent forms for the interviews, but it's impossible. You can't just wander around the world with a camera and get a signature for virtually everyone. But you can, I mean, and ethical documentary practice is exactly the term. I mean, you have to think about that, and there are ways that you can work that I think fall within that kind of care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The question is, do you think that we are moving towards a closed society now during this time of history?
A closed society?
Society, like after 9/11, a lot of our rights has been taken from us. So my question to you is, being that the Patriot Act and all these things that are coming up, are we moving towards a closed society? Like, I don't know.
Well, I think clearly we have been moving pretty dramatically. I don't know if closed society is the word I would use, but we certainly have wished away a lot of our rights, and in ways that I think a lot of people are not even aware of, because they can't imagine themselves as being treated this way by their government, swept up in this particular way, interrogated in this, they don't see themselves in the picture as the person who's kind of under the scope of the state. So I think that it's gone further than a lot of people realize already. I mean, next month we're about to see the launching of spy drones by police departments across the country. And there are all kinds of things that were just unthinkable. I mean, if you said to someone, 15 years ago, oh, this is what is going to be happening in 2012, I think most people wouldn't have believed it. So clearly, that's the direction that we've been moving since 9/11. Where that will end up, I don't know. And I mean, actually, I would love to hear your reflections on this, because I know you've been thinking an awful lot about the security state.
I think a lot of people in here could reflect on this, and we were talking about it in the earlier session this morning. And one of the things that just pops into my mind is the Supreme Court ruling yesterday about that anybody who's arrested can be strip searched. And that there are no limits to be placed on that. And it does strike me that in every direction, when it comes to questions of so-called security, that individual rights are being radically eroded in the name of the security state. But it is one of these paradoxical moments that Matt was kind of alluding to when he talked about things balancing on a coin. Because on the one hand, we're talking about social media and the capacity to communicate across borders and across space in ways that are unprecedented. And the powers to do that are diffused and dispersed in ways that are unprecedented. And yet at the same time, we've got more corporate control over our media than at any other time, in history. And I don't know if there's an analogy to be made with the way in which the security state operates. Clearly, there are zones where we walk around where we can feel very free to do and say what we want. And yet, on the other hand, it is also very clear that the powers to police us have been radically augmented to police everybody. And to what end is as yet unclear. And I think this has probably got to become a site of much more sustained engagement on our part as citizens, in terms of, or not even necessarily as citizens, as people who live in a society. How do we want to be governed? There is still some semblance of an idea of consent of the governed, which is the sort of central democratic idea that we choose the system under which we're governed. But that does seem to be an idea that is receding in the name of security, sometimes in the name of economic growth, in the name of all kinds of things that people are told that they need in order to have a halfway decent life. And so I think that sort of brings me back to this idea of the democratic, the small d democratic, not the democracy promoted by sort of the U.S. to some other country or the Democratic Party, but the small d democratic idea of the consent that must be given to be governed, the choice and the ability to be governed under conditions of our own choosing. That idea, it seems to me, is in peril in the world right now. Certainly it's in peril in the United States. It may be in less peril in some other parts of the world, but it's certainly in peril in the United States.
I would say that it almost certainly is in less peril in other parts of the world because other parts of the world aren't as afraid as we seem to be right now. And I mean, I think that this is really the high cost of fear. And the price of fear seems to me to be a certain kind of short-sightedness, and we've seen it again and again. In the Cold War, for example, the only people who could be comfortable stockpiling, thousands or tens of thousands of nuclear warheads are people who cannot imagine anybody but themselves in charge, right? If you can imagine, who might be occupying the White House in 100 years, 200 years, you probably are not going to feel less comfortable, or you're probably not going to feel as comfortable stockpiling nuclear weapons. It's the same thing with something like the Supreme Court decision yesterday. Only a justice who couldn't imagine themselves being swept up by the police, but also who couldn't imagine somebody in power with the powers of that decision. Only such a justice could make that decision. Because when you start to think, as a historian, when you start to think about change over time and who might end up inhabiting the structures of power that are being built in the 9/11 world, you wouldn't hand over that kind of power to that to that unimaginable future person.
Right.
And it's fear, I think, that has allowed for all of these things to happen.
There was another. Yes.
My name is Nikhil. I don't know if it's too personal of a question, but I don't know, is your main profession a professor at Yale? Because you do a lot of traveling. Do you have sponsors for your website or something that pays for you to travel so much?
That is a great question because, these are the practical questions that matter. I had a very small grant that allowed me to hire an intern. So most of I have people working on the technical staff, mostly graduate students and some of the tech people at Yale the tech people at Yale have really kind of donated a lot of time to this just because they like the project and they feel like we faculty members don't often do interesting things with their technology, so they're very happy to see someone trying. So I have an intern who does paid work. The travel aspect of it has all been built on visits like this, although today I'm in Brooklyn, but last week I was giving a talk in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and next week I'll be in Los Angeles. And so I'm getting universities actually to pay for most of the travel. I come, I give a talk, and then stay an extra day or two and do some of the documentary work around the edges. And that's just been my own strategy for trying to get this done, hoping that when it reaches a kind of critical mass that I'll be ready for a second round of grant writing and can maybe actually really put the money into it that the project calls for. But it's really been done on a shoestring so far.
I have another question. When you conduct your interviews, do you tell your interviewees certain things that they shouldn't say? Because when you put it on your website, do you edit it to cut out certain things that they say maybe because too what's the word, maybe rude depending on what they say? Because I know you said in Utah Obama had the least amount of votes. I know you probably talked to some people that probably had some bad.
What was fascinating about that is they would not talk with the tape recorder on. None of them. So they would say things to me about Obama that were just like, oh, I'm like, oh, you're bringing me my tape recorder, but they wouldn't speak into the tape recorder. Your question is a really good one and an important one. And it's related to the kind of ethical question. Everyone has a chance to put restrictions on their interview. Like if once I have it edited, I'll go back to them and say, is there anything? Almost never has anyone wanted it redacted in any way or cut. What gets put up in the case that there are no, and some people just say, well, you can put it up, but don't attach my name to it, or put it up and you can put my name, but don't attach the name and my photograph. So there are different ways that people make choices about how they want it to be represented. But once there's the agreement, then it goes up as a raw interview, just the whole thing, just as is. They run roughly an hour, most of them. And then from there, I'll try to take out like topical. So one of the tabs, or if you go into the audio tab, one is raw audio and one is edited. And the edited ones are just kind of topical clips, so you can listen to someone talk about Obama for 5 minutes or something that's pulled out of their hour.
So when you edit, you just take out do you take out natural sound, like say like doors closing, depending on what you want?
For the most part, I mean, I did one in Tuscaloosa actually. She didn't have an office, and it was a nice day. She said, let's sit in the quad at the University of Alabama. She's a rock critic, and her husband teaches at the university, so that's where we happened to be. So we sat in the quad, and there was so much ambient noise. I think that one's going to require some editing, where I'm actually going to have to go in and like bring the background noise down and stuff like that. For the most part, I haven't done that at all. It's just like whatever ends up on the tape is on the tape, and you hear like people putting their bottle down, and you hear people tapping the table, or someone walks into the room and says or whatever. But it just what happened is what ends up on the tape.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Beth, and this is actually unrelated to the other questions, but when we talk about Obama, it is a race issue, but we also, I think, have to look at his background, and I don't mean to be nitpicky, but he does come from in the African-American legacy, he does not come from, he's not a descendant of slavery in America in the same way that people who left. So I just thought it was interesting that we haven't really addressed that, or have we?
I mean, I think I used the formulation. He is integrally connected to the community that is descended from slavery, and I would stand by that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most important thing about Obama's relationship to race. To some degree, Obama's relationship to race has certain kinds of chosen qualities to it, but that may be true of a lot of different people in certain ways. So I think making that affiliation in the ways he made it politically, particularly through, say, if you read Dreams from My Father, maybe you have read it, is a really, really compelling account. And then I also think who you marry, the children you have, where you live, all of these things sort of make a significant kind of difference. Although I think your point is well taken in another sense, because I think one could make the argument that he is, in some ways, the first post-colonial president. The first Asian, someone's made the argument he's the first Asian American president because he spent a lot of time in Indonesia and obviously the Hawaii connection. I mean, there are really interesting things about his biography in terms of kind of American immigrant and racial experience that make him very unique and very interesting. There's certainly a lot to talk about there. Back here first, and then Bob.
I wanted to ask, back to the participants, whether they have any ongoing role, or whether there's, going to be maybe like a panel in these different places with people that are involved, or like whether there's, really town-based discussions about these things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I missed the very beginning, so I don't know if that was already addressed.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really just a collection. I mean, some of the people, like I've interviewed Nikhil twice because I interviewed him right before I left for the inauguration, and then I interviewed him almost exactly a year later, and so we talked about first we talked about the historic moment, and then the second time we talked about the first year of the presidency. There's one other person who I've interviewed twice, and he's a hedge fund manager who goes by the name here of Dan Russo, who just speaks really brilliantly about the economic crisis. I interviewed him once, and then I called him again last summer when there was the whole thing over the debt ceiling, and I just wanted to hear his take on it, so I interviewed him a second time. I think those are the only people that I've interviewed twice. Some people I've kind of gotten to know in the context of the project, so I would likely, so for example, this carpenter in New Orleans. Next time I'm in New Orleans, I'll probably look him up and probably see him and may interview him again. But that's not like part of the design of the project, and I haven't really pursued that so much. One of the things, though, when you're talking about the kind of place-basedness of it, there are two groups of students, one at NYU and one at Berkeley, who are actually doing really elaborate projects on their locales to put up as galleries on the site. And that's the model I want to move towards. I mean, what I would really like to do in the long run is become more project director and less author of the project, and have more and more involvement on the part of a lot of different people on the ground in a lot of different places. Because I think that energy is good, but I also think that's the way to do a project like this, is to really make it collective and really, make it cover as much ground as possible. And those clusters of people I think would be in a better position to do the kind of thing that you're suggesting, or at least indicating, in terms of having kind of a steady, ongoing conversation with a set of local people.
Bob, and then
I was intrigued by something that you said, Professor Singh, about Obama's post-coloniality. And it connected with something that we were talking about before, and that I've thought about a great deal, which is the relationship between the unprecedentedness of this president on many levels and in many dimensions, many vectors, on the one hand, and as far as in my experience, and I'm older than most of the people, the totally unprecedented violence of the reaction to his presidency. The Republican Party, in my mind, in my judgment, has completely lost its mind. I mean, starting from the day he was inaugurated, when they said, they weren't going to give him an inch, and they haven't given him an inch. Meanwhile, they're slitting their own throats. They've now basically turned off the possibility of any real success with women's voting. They're trying to reverse all kinds of voter registration policies all over the country. I mean, it's like they're on a speed train for Chile in 1973. I mean, it's really unbelievable. And because we don't know what will happen, and I think a lot of people have felt all along that, the American voting public isn't going to stand for this once it really comes out in a debate. It'll be repudiated, and I hope that's the case. But do you think that there's a connection between this amazing violence and the absolute novelty of this president? I mean, this is a question for both.
Go ahead. No. I want to just try to be brief, because I think it's a great formulation. I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. So the short answer is I think yes. This is such a violent such a violent moment in a violent country. Again, you all have been politically, socially alive and conscious. There hasn't been a time when the country hasn't been at war. That might even be true for us, in some ways.
It is true.
And war is a sort of a normalized, backdrop to the society. And I do think that there is a contingent of the country that is, in some ways, increasingly organized into the form of a party that really sees itself as imperiled in all kinds of ways, demographically, racially, theologically, and in a country that is so dedicated to war, where the institutional architecture, as we were talking about before, is so designed around the security state, if those people get full control of the levers of power, there is no, all bets are off to some degree, both in terms of how much further things could go in terms of foreign policy, how much further things could go in terms of domestic repression. I don't think that it would come without significant resistance. I mean, I think one of the reassuring things about the United States is that it is a somewhat unruly place to govern, and I think that is actually.
It's actually ungovernable.
It may be at some level ungovernable, and I don't for a minute think like all the white people are racists, or anything like that. And I think we have won some battles on the terrain of culture, on the terrain of how people identify themselves, and most people's identifications are much more complicated than that sort of rigid, sort of racial, theological, political line that now seems to emanate from the Republican Party. So I think those are all things that are, should give us hope. But in terms of, where we stand right now politically on the spectrum and institutionally and economically, we're in a very dangerous place, I think, and have been for some time. So, I mean, that would be just my very quick gut reaction to. You had a comment again, and then we'll.
Probably should make that the last one.
Maybe last two? Yeah, okay.
I have two, but they're long. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about martial law? I hear about it a lot, and it scares me. Martial law is going to happen. And another thing, what makes Obama different than any other president we had besides his color?
Do you want to make your comment, and then we'll try to wrap it up?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. You were talking about history, the importance of history. And I think that we, as a country, tend to take an overly reductive approach in analyzing history. Not us, clearly, American studies scholars in the making, but in general, I think that that's what we do. And I think a close analysis of history could provide us with more, not just more of an understanding of our current state, but more patience for our current state. Because when we look at, for instance, the civil rights movement, most of what we know about it comes from like 3-minute montages that we see in black and white over the course of our lives. And I think that that reductive portrayal of history, like coupled with our tenuous understanding of history and the fact that this generation is one that's obsessed with instant gratification, I think that that has contributed to our disillusionment with Obama. The fact that it was an instant change that occurred as soon as he entered office. And that's just a rambling statement, but I guess the question at the end of it is, what do you think that our generation can do in order to continue to enact our civic powers without losing hope?
Yeah. Well, in a way, if I can just try to connect these two questions, because I think your first question about martial law, I think that the most dangerous thing in this country is that it won't look like martial law, and that makes it all the more dangerous. And I think that we're already maybe like a half a step into that process where it's the benign face of fascism, right? That it's almost unbelievable that it could be fascism because this is America. What are you talking about, right? We have all the, so there's. Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm not. I mean, so what I'm saying is that that's the danger, is that our political culture already has situated us to believe that our freedoms are inalienable, and to the degree that we won't recognize or don't recognize when they are in fact being alienated. And so it's not going to be anything as stark as martial law, but it will be as brutal, right? I mean, that's what I see as the bigger danger, and the kind of the danger of the drift, which kind of it gets back to your question. I mean, I think that a couple of things for your generation. One is to try to cultivate that sense of revolutionary patience that we were talking about before, because I think that that's crucial. Another, and I was thinking of this because of the way you posed your question about history. I think one of the most important images from the civil rights era, and in that 3-minute montage, it's the image you won't see most of the time. And this goes back to something you were saying this morning, Nikhil, that the image that we're encouraged to hold in our heads of Martin Luther King is him at the mall saying, "I have a dream." More important image of him is having his arm twisted by an Alabama sheriff and having his head driven into the hood of a squad car. Because King was on the right side of history, but he was on the wrong side of the law. He was hated, he was despised, he was an outlaw during much of the time that he was doing the work that we now cherish and take for granted and forget. And I think that as students, and I include both of us in that category as well, as students, the thing to do is to hold in our head those images from history that will not only allow us to have the kind of revolutionary patience that we need, but also to remember the things that really need to be remembered and lay out the lessons that are really going to be usable to us as we're constantly struggling with whatever's coming down the pike, and there will always be something coming down the pike to struggle against.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.